New Game of Thrones. Is House of Dragons worth it? Let's find out. Back again with another review. My name is Josh. Thanks for checking out the channel. And if you click the thumbnail and you've made it this far, then you are aware that we are talking about Game of Thrones. This is Game of Thrones House of Dragons, so the new series on HBO that's based on things that happened long before. I'm trying to remember, I think it said 172 years, 179 years before most of what had happened. At least I believe it was Daenerys and a couple of the other folks in there. So it's a couple hundred years, if I'm not mistaken, pre the first Game of Thrones series that we got on HBO and from the author. And this one, it absolutely is Game of Thrones. Just a lot of plotting on other folks, and it's definitely a show that you've got to be geared into or set up for your mindset to go that way. So I think definitely coming into this one, it's been a long time since I'd watched Game of Thrones, and I had to get my mindset right for that, because if you come into it thinking it's going to be super action-y, or if it's going to be very happy in most parts, that's just not really Game of Thrones. It's just drama. I mean, this is literally, it is a drama to the point of, it's about the power of the throne, the lives and all the different houses that it's going to affect, and then murdering and mayhem and all kinds of violence, sometimes over the top violence, and let's not forget dragons. I'm a big fan of dragons, and this one, there's definitely a little bit more. Well, so far, but it's definitely starting off a little bit better dragon-wise than other Game of Thrones. Other Game of Thrones ended with a couple dragons, but this one's starting with a good number of dragons. So what we're going to do is we are going to talk about the first Game of Thrones episode for House of Dragons, and we're going to try and stay as spoiler-free as possible, but just in case you haven't seen that one, you might want to watch it. We'll get to that in a second, but I definitely suggest that you do. So this one picks up a couple hundred years before the previous Game of Thrones, like we talked about previously, and the opening of the show is very much kind of a montage, monologue kind of storytelling about getting you set to where they are, and it's definitely, there's a lot of information, which is what Game of Thrones is, especially early on, but they kind of synopsize it fairly well when it seems like this is a time where the Seven Kingdoms are at relative peace for the most part, and it's being ruled by a Targaryen, but the Targaryen doesn't really have an heir, or male heir. So as we're going through the intro and it's explaining kind of the situation and where everybody is, who's in charge, and that it's decided upon who's going to be the next heir in the Targaryen family, you have Viserys, which ultimately I don't think this is a spoiler because he's definitely clearly pretty important in the show, and it happens in the first 10 minutes of the show. So he's definitely going to be the one that's put in charge, and you can already see that there's going to be some spite and some regret and anger towards some other of the families that wanted to be in charge, and I think that will always be the case, and henceforth, if we didn't, we would not have a Game of Thrones show. So you get the announcement of basically who is going to be inheriting the crown, the rule, the kingdom, so to speak, the Seven Kingdoms, and then it's just a time jump, and from there, I don't remember if it says like 10, 15 years, something like that. Either way, you have the families that have been in charge for a little while, and then it's been left to live and see how things are going. And some things are going well, some are not going well. And you get introduced to a more broad cast of characters. You get all the different families that are there. You get some little nods to some of the families that are in Game of Thrones, of course, and I'm sure they'll pop back up in here. But you have the Starks are there a little bit. I've seen some Lannister, I believe. There was Baratheon is there as well. And then, of course, you get the main characters or the main families so far, in that you have the Hightowers. So you have Sir Otto Hightower, and you have his daughter, Alessia, something like that. You also have, clearly, the Targaryens. The Targaryens, you have a pretty big family tree, but for the most part, you have Viserys. I'm horrible at these names, so that's something that's going to pop up. Viserys, who is the king in charge. You have his brother Daemon, and then you have the daughter Rhaenyra. You have Rhaenyra, the daughter, who is probably going to be, I'm guessing, one of the main focuses. So you get a good variety of characters in here, but it seems to be mainly focused in this episode, at least, on the Targaryens and to some extent the Hightowers. And you get exposed to those. The actors that are in them are some really interesting ones, because there's a couple of them that I have recognized, like, it visually, like I know who they are, but I couldn't tell you who they were. So as I was looking them up, I did know that the guy that's playing Daemon Targaryen, he is Matt Smith. So that's the younger brother, and he apparently was one of the Doctor Who's. I did not know that because I've never watched Doctor Who, but I guess that's a pretty big deal to be a Doctor Who. And now he's playing I don't know what kind of character he is. They try very hard in this one to set him up kind of as a villain, but he also seems like he's a person of the time, even though some of the stuff is pretty raw. But he's there, and then you also have the king, Paddy Considine, something like that, where I've seen him a good bit in smaller roles, but never one that was like the leading role. Like, I remember seeing him in one of the Bourne movies. I think he was a reporter that was uncovering everything that was happening in those movies. Didn't last very long in that one. So he's already lasted longer than I thought he would, honestly. No spoilers. Seems to be a good actor. When you go to the Hightower House, you have the main guy, which this one kind of freaked me out a little bit. His name is Riz Ifans, maybe Scandinavian of some sort, something of that effect. But he was definitely in Amazing Spider-Man, so the one with Andrew Garfield, and he was the Lizard. So he was the professor that played the Lizard guy. I knew I'd seen him before, but he has a very kind of zany look to him. But that was not who I thought this was. I only noticed that by seeing his picture on IMDb, not actually by what he looked like in the show. In the show, he looks almost unrecognizable to what I thought he looked like, or he does look like outside of the show. So kudos to them on that costume design stuff. It definitely looked pretty solid. So you get a good bunch of characters here. I don't know the lady that's playing Renaria, Millie Alcock. She's pretty young, seemed like, but seemed to play the role pretty well. There's also Alicent Hightower. Alicent Hightower is the other Hightower daughter, which I assume is around the same age as the Targaryen daughter, because they seem to be best friends. Maybe more. I don't know what's going on with that yet, but we'll figure it out as we go. So you get a good generalized cast, and that's only a couple of them. Those are the ones that I could kind of remember, and the story seemed to kind of focus on and bring back pretty consistently. But there are a lot of folks. The acting is something that seems pretty solid. I mean, that's definitely what Game of Thrones, I think, is known for, is creating really good heroes and villains and believable characters that you can relate with or just really loathe entirely. And I think they're kind of sticking to that pretty well. So that's definitely a plus. Cinematography and everything about the show itself looks pretty solid. I'm kind of torn on this just because it looks so clean. Like, the graphics look really good. The dragons, I think, do look good. The King's Landing and a lot of the landscapes. So when the landscapes are practical and they're really there, it looks pretty cool and realistic. But a lot of the big sweeping scopes, like, you know, if it was real and they were doing drone shots and stuff like that, it looks pretty CGI and it looks very clean. And I'm not sure, I haven't gone back and watched Game of Thrones in a while, so maybe I should, but it definitely seemed a little more lived in and kind of torn down, I guess. But to be fair, this is, I guess, House Targaryen when they're kind of at their prime and their apex, so the ascension of their civilization, so maybe it would be nice and clean and really proper, but it looked pretty good. The colors were, I liked them a lot some of the time. Like, they had some really good contrasting colors. Some of the blues were really bright, but they also had a very kind of dryish tone to it, so I'm not sure exactly what the color palette's going to be like the whole time, but it was definitely pretty solid and pretty good. The music, I'm kind of undetermined on, or undecided, because honestly, for the most part, I didn't really notice it, which I guess could be a good thing or a bad thing when it comes to music, except on several parts I did start to hear little inklings of the actual Game of Thrones theme got thrown in there, and then that brought that nostalgia back and got you back in the setting a good bit, and I really appreciated that. So I'll have to pay attention more, a little bit more to the music, but I did really appreciate the little callback there to the sound. So for this one, my main positives for the first episode, and kind of for the series thus far, because that's kind of really what this is, the pilot's really important to get you sucked back in, or really set the setting for, pave the pavement, that sounds so much better, for the actual story that's going to be there. But I think the show did a very good job. The acting, again, like I say, for the most part, I can't really think of anybody I thought did a bad job, or anybody that stood out to me. Again, not necessarily super familiar with all the folks that are doing the acting, but they were doing pretty good, because I definitely bought what they were selling. The actual feel and the storytelling and the dialogue, to a certain extent, it felt like Game of Thrones to me. So this does feel like Game of Thrones. Like, again, as I was saying earlier, it takes a bit to put your mindset right about what you should be expecting and what you're looking for. But this very much so felt like Game of Thrones. Like the conspiring, again, the way that they, that some of them really honorable and some are not, and they all live by slightly different standards, but there's always that pursuit for power. There's some good one-liners that are thrown into there. Absolute power corrupts absolute. It's probably not what's actually in the show, but there was something that was very similar to that, and it was pretty solid. Another thing that I thought they did really well was actually a lot more of the Easter eggs are kind of callbacks to the future of the series, since this is a prequel. Whether it be the different houses or different, they talked about a couple different prophecies and some things like that they were leaning towards, and I thought they did it in a really good way that wasn't over the top to where if you weren't super familiar with it, you were completely lost. But at the same time, you didn't have to be an uber nerd. Again, I like Game of Thrones a good bit, but I don't remember everything about it, and I have not read the books. So I was able to pick up on some good bits of tidbit knowledge and be like, oh, I remember that, and or that's where this is going. So I appreciated that a good bit. It didn't feel super tacked on, is more or less what I'm getting at here, and I thought they did that in a really good manner. One of the biggest things that they really just kind of hammered home is this world and this realm, it's brutal. I mean, it's survival of the fittest or the one that plots and schemes the best, but they really try and bring that to a point a lot of different ways, but it's a brutal world, and they get that point across really well. There's a couple things on the opposite end of the spectrum that I will take away as a little bit more negatives on this one, and that could change as time goes on, and I see how it kind of flows out. One of the things that kind of got me early on is just have to go out of their way to say is that, a woman can't rule. It's like, okay, I'm pretty sure there's going to be some women rulers in this time because I've already seen it in the future, but they can lay that again, that's fine. But they were just a little on the nose with, okay, is this going to be very, very woman-centric powerful, which isn't a bad thing by any means, but you don't have to say it. You could just do it. Just make it there. I don't have to be told this is what the point of the story is going to be, is to prove that a woman can do this. I've seen that in the other show, and I've seen it done really well. So let's just go ahead and do that, and you don't have to just hit me over the head with it. But to be fair, how this episode ends, no spoilers, but how they get to a certain resolution that they were kind of hinting at throughout, I bought it. I will say I bought it. So it didn't seem like it was tacked on or forced too much. So I appreciated that in the long run. But that was something that kind of started off and I was like, okay, here we go. There's been other shows where they just have to put certain things, or, certain social justice issues, which are important things, but I don't need it shoved down my throat when it could be told in a very organic and good and compelling way, not just do this, you can't do that. So that was one where I was kind of a little timid at the beginning, but I don't really feel like that's what happened on this one, so in the long run. So I was pretty solidly happy with that. I will say, as I've talked a little bit about, like, it's a harsh world and that there's a lot of violence. I mean, if you've watched Game of Thrones, you know it's a very violent show. I mean, there are scenes where people's throats are cut. They end up, eating certain people or getting torn to pieces. There's just a lot of violence that happens in Game of Thrones. And for the most part, I feel like when the violence is done best in Game of Thrones is when it's really earned. So if it's a bad villain or if it's a character that, has been, questing to do something and, the violence is a result of that and it seems more justified, that's always one that you're just very amped to see, and you can kind of maybe get away with a little more of the gratuitousness of it. There are several things in this episode that I just did not like and did not think that they needed to be there. Clearly I'm a guy, so clearly when I see another guy get his pecker cut off and thrown in front of him, I'm not a huge fan of that. At the same time, I could take it, whatever, it's fine. It's not the biggest deal. It just doesn't seem like it really needed to be there. I get it that, everything that's happening is pretty drastic. The King's Watch, or the City Watch as they're called in this one, not too many spoilers here, they're definitely doing some dastardly things under the supervision of their commander. But I mean, when you have people getting their hands cut off and all different kinds of things, that's pretty drastic enough that I think you kind of get the message. So there's a little bit of that. The biggest thing was the whole kind of plot around this first episode. Again, like we talked about, it's setting up who's going to be heir to the throne, and when certain things go a little bit wrong, and there is a birth scene that's happening in this one, and there's something that kind of has to happen with that, and the king has to make a decision about things, and he makes an interesting one, and it's approached in an interesting manner, but they show a ton of graphic shots of it about what they're doing, and I just think it could have been done, It could have been a lot smoother and cleaner. Again, I know it's meant to be brutal and in a time where they don't have medicine and all these different types of, or much medicine. I get that, but you don't have to do what you did in this one to me, because you took a scene that, you know, you could have implied a lot. You could have shown some gore and some blood and stuff like that, but you took it a couple steps too far. It was just kind of gross for the sake of being gross and kind of shocking for the sake of being shocking. Not to like Saw levels, but I mean, there's some stuff you're just like, okay. I'm sure this was brutal back in this time, this fictitious time of when this was, but I feel like I could have gotten away with a lot less of it. Granted, I also was eating at the time, and I did not feel very good about finishing my food. I mean, I did finish it. It just took me a couple minutes to let things process, settle down, and then I just kept working on my food, baby. Ooh, is that too soon? Maybe a bad taste, I'm not too sure. But I felt like the violence in a couple of the scenes on this one was just a little over the top, just trying to, you know, let people know, hey, we are Game of Thrones, we do, you know, horrible, violent things, which again, I guess you could do, but it can come around much more organically. Again, there's even like a tournament that's going on where there's a bunch of fighting that happens and all of a sudden it turns really, really violent and people just start murdering each other. Which, again, I don't mind the violence in that case as much as I don't quite understand the law or the lawless nature of the tournament or the setting that they're in. I don't know if they've really established that there is rule because there's a king and there's just doesn't seem to be a lot of consequences for certain things that happen so far. Now that might change down the line, but we're going to have to see as we get to it. But my overall takeaways on this one are, I think it's a very hard thing to do a prequel or a sequel to a show that was that big and that instrumental to pop culture and just everything that went around it. I mean, that was a life-changing kind of show for a lot of people, in the fact that they just really enjoyed it and they talked about it. And I mean, it just causes a lot of discussion. So that's a big task to take that on. And I think the showrunners have started off very solidly. I mean, it's a good beginning episode. There's a lot of groundwork that need to be laid. There's a lot of reminders and trying to get you back into the mindset that this is Game of Thrones. But overall, I would definitely recommend folks check this one out. I mean, you're going to need to. If you can get through the first one and try and get your mindset on who everybody is, I think that's really going to set the future up for this one pretty well. For me, that's the biggest thing, is I just have to remember to be patient with the show, because I ended up enjoying Game of Thrones so much because of everything that happened towards the end of Game of Thrones. Not necessarily the last season, which I wasn't the biggest objection or objector of. I kind of enjoyed parts of how they ended that story. Some of it, I understand some concerns. But for everything from the last 2 or 3 seasons, the resolution and the things that happened, that came from the first 4 or 5 seasons building to that. And I think that's where I needed to take a step back and be like, okay, I gotta remember, this is not a movie where it's just an action movie, you get some betrayal and you do this. This is, you know, a season of probably setup of twists and turns and backstabbing and positioning, and then there'll be a couple of scenes of payoff where it could be very actiony or very violent. But be patient and wait for that, because it was worth it in the end for the last series for the most part. But yeah, overall, I definitely recommend it. I'd say check it out if you haven't. We're definitely going to be running the gambit of all, I believe it's 10 episodes on this one, so we'll have a review up for number 2 pretty quick. But let me know what you thought, if that sounded at all correct, or if I'm missing some stuff, which is absolutely possible, because there's so much information in this. It just takes a bit. Got to process it. All right, don't forget, like, share, subscribe. Peace out.